Hey everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, COVID-19, What's Next? My name is Nadine Vernon. I'm the Vice President at Cision Insights UK, and I'll be your moderator for today. We have a packed agenda today. We'll be discussing the new normal and how PR might be altered in a now coronavirus-marked world. We've talked a lot about how COVID-19 has changed the media and how brands have adapted to new challenges. But as businesses start to emerge from lockdown, it's time to start thinking about what comes next. So here's what we'll be covering today. We'll be giving you some recommendations for the recovery phase, looking at top tips on how to connect with audiences, as well as looking at how COVID-19 has affected journalists. Some housekeeping points before we get into it. We'll be tweeting throughout using the hashtag COVID-19comms. Please keep an eye on the Cision UK Twitter handle and get involved. We'd love to hear from you. We'll also have a Q&A at the end. If you have a look around the platform, you'll see on the left-hand side there's a Q&A widget. Please submit your questions throughout the session, and we'll try and get to as many as we can at the end. There'll also be a recording made available afterwards. But before we kick off, let me introduce our fantastic speakers. We have Cision's very own Insights Director, Dave Reynolds. Dave has 10 years experience in the communication and media insights industry and leads Cision Insights retail and FMCG teams. He's an expert in implementing and refining measurement programs for global clients. And his focus is on providing innovative and creative solutions, enabling clients to measure performance and impact successfully. We're also joined by Sinead Gray, Joint Managing Director at Kindred and former President of Bloom UK, the professional network for women in communications. Sinead's expertise spans PR, social, digital, and integrated campaigns. She's delivered award-winning campaigns for Camelot, Fox, Penguin, Lufthansa, and NCS, to name a few. Sinead returned to Kindred in 2016 after a spell at Ogilvy, specializing in social and content, and became managing partner in early 2018. Passionate about supporting the careers of women in comms, Sinead founded the annual Bloomfest conference. Welcome both, really exciting to have you both on board. And without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to Dave to kick us off.
Great, thanks Nadine. Hi everybody. So I'm going to talk through a few slides that look to predict what to expect in the coming months as a result of the current situation we're in with coronavirus. And I'll be turning to Sinead for some further insight as we go along as well. To kick things off with, the way that we're going to try and predict what's going to come ahead of us now, we're going to look to some research that Cision have conducted on the Chinese media landscape. As we're all aware, China is around 2 months ahead of where we are in the Western world in terms of locking down around 2 months before we did, coming out of lockdown around 2 months earlier than we did as well. And so we did a piece of research that basically looked at what worked well when coming out of a lockdown situation, what communication strategies and content worked particularly well in that environment, and what of those kind of findings and learnings can we apply to the situation that we're in right now. So the first really interesting stat to look at, if we break down the coronavirus period into different phases. Phase 2, we can call that lockdown period, where we're all sat at home, not able to go out to shops and to consume and so on. And now we're entering into this phase 3, where gradually things are being reopened. First it was retailers, now we've got pubs and hairdressers opening up in the near future as well. And what's really interesting to see from the research we did in China was that during phase 2, this lockdown period, 57% of all media coverage in China was related to COVID-19. So very much focused on that topic, as you might expect. But as it moved into that easing of lockdown period in phase 3, only 39% of media coverage in China was focused on coronavirus. And I think why that's interesting is because there's a little kind of oxygen bubble that opens up as we're in this new phase to start communicating around non-coronavirus topics. I know there's obviously during phase 2 in that lockdown period, concerns about how do we continue to communicate in this environment. But as we move into phase 3, making use of the research we've seen in China, there's definitely the little space now to start communicating on non-coronavirus topics. Additionally, I think there's a certain level of fatigue, coronavirus fatigue, that audiences are feeling. While this is a huge impact on our life and something we're dealing with on a daily basis, I think audiences are looking for other news stories and other kind of pieces of insights to consume at this point in time and feeling a little bit overwhelmed by the constant deluge of coronavirus-related coverage. You can also see from the UK government recently deciding to row back from doing daily news briefings. At that side of communications as well, there's less of a hyper-focus on coronavirus at this point in time. So I'm going to throw over to a quick question to Sinead. How much do you think, Sinead, that readers are facing a degree of coronavirus fatigue at this point in time?
Yeah, we're definitely seeing this too, and it's an interesting moment of time at the moment. As a country, we're no longer in crisis stage, but we're not fully, out of lockdown, and we're a long way from normal. So in terms of the stories that we've been putting out recently, there's definitely still appetite for things about the wider fallout from COVID-19, but there's also been an uplift in desire to see kind of good news stories and lighter news. What I would say though, if you are doing a good news story, it really needs to be done authentically. I think we really need to be cognizant of tone at the moment, because while people don't want all doom and gloom, there's been a lot of that, and probably still more to come. We need to be aware that some people are still really having a tough time at the moment, whether that's because of bereavements or financial hardships or just general anxiety about what's still to come. So where we are doing good news stories, they really need to be thought through and be genuine.
Yeah, absolutely. So moving on to what that new normal looks like in this recovery phase that we're in, if we kind of drill down on 4 key disciplines and some of the recommendations that we can make as a result of the research that we've done. So in terms of media and audience, I think one trend we've always seen, particularly in the lockdown phase, is that there's less time for news consumption. As people have started to work from home, that part of commuting to work has disappeared, where a lot of people would consume typically a lot of media. There's also been indicative research so far that podcast consumption has declined a little bit as well, which is interesting to see. Those audiences are in the process of returning to work. They might be coming back from furlough. Generally there's a lot of uncertainty around the future. You've seen a lot of job losses announced in the past couple of days. So again, it's important to be kind of cognizant of that general consumer atmosphere right now, that kind of feeling of uncertainty of what is coming next. But when we move on to talk about things like corporate communications, this is where your company or your clients can look to bring those recovery plans and long-term strengths to the fore, highlighting how you have adapted to the situation and how your strengths can help you to go forwards. It's also important, based on the research that we've seen, to try and look at the positive outcomes of the crisis. Like Sinead mentions, it's important to get the tone right when you're making those kind of communications. But there are definitely some changes for good that have happened as a result of this. People becoming perhaps a little bit more eco-conscious and less traveling is one kind of indicative example of that. Another example is from a corporate communications perspective around community, staff, and all things CSR. I think a lot of companies right now, a lot of brands are communicating around those messages, and that's something that's going to work really well. It's just a challenge to find a distinct way to communicate around those messages. One of the pieces of research we did in China was around a company called Lao Xianji, and their CEO very publicly got a letter from their employees saying, we will accept a salary decrease as a result of the coronavirus. And he had a press conference, tore it up, and basically spoke about how he needed to make sure he looked after his staff because it was the most important part of their business right now. So obviously that generated a huge amount of positive coverage for them in China, and it's not something perhaps that is possible for all of us and all of our clients to do at this point in time, but it's a good example of the kind of community and staff related messaging that's going to be quite effective right now. From a management and communications perspective, I know there's a little bit of nervousness around when do you start to communicate around, certain topics of production, of sales, and things like that. Again, based on the research we've done in China, this phase is the right time to start doing that. I think it's important to be cognizant of the different, lockdown restrictions in different countries. And even within the UK now, we can see there will be more regional lockdowns that might take place, with Leicester being announced as the first one. So while it's time perhaps to start communicating on these topics and think about how production restarting and so on, you're going to need to be nimble in case these things change, and to make sure you avoid any kind of criticism that might come from getting people back into production facilities in areas that have high levels of coronavirus. But it's also the time to talk about new exciting plans that your organization might have, and for your leaders to really take this opportunity to kind of show how they're going forwards and taking charge in an uncertain world. And finally, on product communications, I think we're all pretty, familiar with the idea that there is no back to normal. I think at the beginning, we all thought maybe in a month or two, everything will go back to as it was, but that's clearly not the case anymore. I think it's important to focus on how existing and new products can be used in this new world. If I mentioned the phrase contactless delivery 5 months ago, no one would know what that is. However, again, the piece of research we did looking at the Chinese media landscape identified one company called Meituan, who started contactless delivery in January of this year. They're the first ones to do it. They got a ton of really positive news coverage as a result of it, earned media coverage as a result of that. And of course, now the idea has been pinched by everyone who wants to do something similar. So that's one nice example of a kind of adaptation that can be made to fit a product or a service into the new environment that we're in. And additionally, it's important to think about how your products could perhaps bring people together at a distance. So Sinead, it would be great if we can dive a little bit more into the SME narrative, since I know a lot of our audience constitutes such businesses who have been particularly affected by the pandemic. So as a managing director of an agency, what do you think is next for SMEs as we come out on the other side?
I mean, I think there's a reality that for all SMEs, no matter what sector, what industry, 2021 will be a year of rebuilding on a really tight cost base. I think every cost and every salary is going to be under a lot of scrutiny. But having said that, I also think there's some really exciting opportunities for SMEs. So firstly, I think there is an opportunity to reward loyalty. A lot of SMEs either have been or will be, as we open up, have been kept afloat by the loyalty of their customer base. And I just think as we kind of get towards the end of this year, there's a really lovely moment to say thank you to those customers. And I really hope that something good that comes out of 2020 is that we all feel like much more motivated to spend our money with small businesses and to shop locally. So I think that's a moment that SMEs can use for their benefit. And then I'd also say there's an opportunity to be greener. We have had this enforced pause or stop put on all of us at the moment. And I think there's a moment now as we rebuild, as we open up again, we don't just have to do it how we did it before. I was talking to a fireplace retailer recently who used the enforced shutdown of their showroom to actually completely redesign it to bring their electric range front and foremost, and actually to be on the front foot of saying, the improvements you've made and why you've made those improvements. I think now is the time, because the media narrative, I think, is going to massively pick up over the next few months on topics around climate change. And there could be some good news stories to be told there, hopefully.
Fantastic. So on the following slide, we'll talk through a little bit about what now. As we said, there's a lot to consider as you start to communicate in this new environment. I think one of the biggest challenges is how to cut through in this environment that we're in, with so many businesses, companies, and brands communicating quite similar messaging around reopening, around the safety of their staff, and so on. So a few insights we've pulled out from, again, the research we've done with looking at the Chinese media landscape. I think what worked particularly well in that environment was those companies and brands that could stand out with a really unique message were able to cut through very strongly. However, any sort of messaging, it's important to be very well researched and prepared for debate, particularly if it relates to social distancing or reopening of certain facilities, because there is definitely going to be the odd question mark here and there about, is this a safe way to go? Is this the right way to do that? So it's important to be well researched and prepared for those kind of debates. We also saw that authentic first-person narratives have worked really well, particularly with that altruistic or educative theme, again, sort of coming back to what Sinead was highlighting previously, looking for those positive stories, but making sure they have the right tone. And given this new environment that we're in, I think that's a really good way to try and cut through. And additionally, sharing positivity. Our audiences are looking for reassurance and to understand what this new normal looks like. But additionally, they're still craving those feel-good narratives. The amount of puppy videos I might have watched in the last few months, just craving that little bit of positivity in my news feeds. It's been pretty high. And some really interesting stats that we can call out on the bottom here. This is from a piece of work that the Reuters Institute for the Study of Journalism have done recently. And they have a really fantastic report that I recommend checking out. But they found that during the pandemic, 72% of media consumers are turning to top-tier outlets for news. What that means is that audiences are falling back to those outlets they trust the most in this environment. And it'll be interesting to see how much that stays true as we go forward. I think what's also interesting is the 4 most trusted outlets in the UK, as per their research, were BBC News, ITV News, the FT, and local newspapers. So the first 2 are broadcasts, which is very interesting that they're the most trusted. The FT we might expect to be one of the most trusted, but community newspapers, local newspapers being one of the most trusted is really interesting to see. And I think this pandemic situation has made us much more community focused than we've ever been before. And so I think that's definitely an angle to potentially explore going forward. 18% of audiences don't trust news from politicians and established news outlets. I think that's something that we've sort of come to expect given the current sort of media climate that we're in. So there will always be naysayers and criticism of campaigns and work they might be doing from people who aren't really trusting of that narrative. And then what this piece of research also found was that an increasing number of people are turning to social media to connect directly with brands. This is really interesting during that lockdown phase where people have lost that experience of going to a store or going to a restaurant and interacting directly with their favorite brands and companies. People increasingly turn to social media to try and feel that connection and that experience. One thing we've seen that works really well is where IKEA, they shared their famous meatball recipe so people could make that at home and have that IKEA experience. And what we found was it generated a significant amount of coverage on traditional media online sites, but it got shared massively onto social as people are looking for ways to engage and still feel a part of brands they love. So even though we're coming out of this lockdown position right now and things are starting to reopen, IKEA is reopen and certain restaurants are as well, there will be cases where, again, like has already been mentioned, some people will still be a little bit concerned about going out and experiencing these places in public, have some reservations about going back into that physical shopping experience. And there will be more lockdowns, localized lockdowns during the course of things as well. So I think even though we're out of that lockdown phase, I think that's something to think about going forwards in terms of communicating and sharing ways that people can experience your brand through social media. We have a quick COVID comms checklist on the right-hand side here. That kind of echo the point that we just made. So, for example, lead by example and speak to what you know. It's really important to be concise and well-researched with the content that you're sharing. Like Sinead mentioned previously as well, being empathetic and being aware of, the situation and the environment that we're in and the different concerns the different audiences will have around, returning to some kind of new normal situation. But additionally, it's important, of course, to target your pitches to the right people and to use subject matter experts and expertise where it makes sense to as well. So I'll throw over another question to Sinead here. Coming back to that topic that we've already discussed a little bit of positivity and altruism, can you talk us through how your agency has kind of engaged with that community feel, if at all, and how important you think that is for SMEs going forwards?
Yeah, so we're an agency that specialises in positive change. So quite early on in this pandemic, we decided that we wanted to use our skills for good if we could at this time. So we launched something called Positive Hour, which is like no strings attached, free hour of consultancy for any SME or brand or charity that's got a problem or something that they want to talk about and they wanted advice on. And we've done quite a few of those of the Positive Hour meetings over the past 3 months now, because we're 3 months into this. And they've been good because we've been able to genuinely be helpful to the people that we've talking to, whether that's suggesting media outlets or journalists they can try or coming up, helping them work through ideas or come up with new angles for things. So it's been great for the people that we've spoken to, but I can't lie, it's been amazing for us. Every time we've done one of those calls, we've come off it feeling great, and actually just being generous with your time and with your skills and with your expertise is something that we've seen on lots of levels throughout this pandemic. And I like to think that it'll be something that stays as we move forward. And Positive Hour is still open, it's still running. So anyone who would like to book in and do it, please do. We love doing them, and you just book via the Kindred agency website.
Fantastic. So the last slide that I'll talk through.
Great, thank you both.
I've got one more slide, sorry, Nadine, before we jump ahead. There's still the view from the other side.
Go ahead.
So this is the annual Cision survey, State of the Media survey, where we ask journalists for their opinions, how we can best work with them as communications and PR professionals. And ultimately, it ends up being quite a well-timed piece of research, as this survey was done during those first 2 months of the pandemic. So we really got a sense of, during this new normal, how best to approach journalists and how best to try and land stories with them. So the survey was done with over 3,000 journalists in 15 countries, and it's available to download from the Cision website as well. I think 6 key findings that really stood out for us, and again, it kind of links back to what we've talked about on previous slides. The way that journalists prefer to be communicated with is via email. I think a trend across all of these points here is that journalists are feeling the pinch in terms of resources right now, even before the coronavirus, but even now as we're moving through it, and redundancies. For example, today the BBC announced 450 staff were being made redundant. Resources are really tight within media organizations. So I think they prefer to have those communications come in via email, those pitches come in via email, so they can kind of work through them at their own pace. It was interesting to see as well that one key thing they're looking for is for making experts available for video interviews. So, we've all become a little bit more comfortable working from home, being on video from home, and so on. So this is definitely an opportunity to do more of that sort of providing that expert voice that can help to support your narrative. As long as you're making sure that any children that are in need of biscuits aren't bursting into the room like someone was on a call with BBC News yesterday. That's perhaps a good way to go viral at the same time. Finding the local news angle, I already mentioned that there's definitely more of a connection to your communities now. I personally feel that, and I think a lot of us feel the same way. So reading local news sites, but even national sites and national journalists were looking for that local angle for their story. I think the challenge with coronavirus specifically is that often it's such a big picture and it's just a lot of numbers to deal with and process that we sometimes struggle to really see the kind of human cost. So sometimes that more local news angle works really well. And even besides the coronavirus kind of news angle, I think, like I said, we're all more hyper-connected to our local environment right now. For example, again, touching on what Sinead just mentioned, there's a local cinema that's just down my street that will shut down without funding from the local community. There's a local newspaper who's taking up their cause, and hopefully that sort of community feel can help to ensure that we can continue to have that cinema in place. Look for new angles and pitch positive stories. So again, this survey was done in March, February of this year, as we were only just getting into lockdown. And even then, journalists were highlighting that sense of fatigue around coronavirus stories and around bad news stories. So we already mentioned that consumers are feeling a little bit, and journalists for sure at this point are feeling it as well. So I think they're definitely on the lookout for those feel-good stories, as long as, like Sinead mentioned earlier, they're along the right tone, the right narrative, and being sort of cognizant of different audiences within them. But additionally, looking for those new angles, like I mentioned before, a lot of companies and brands right now are communicating very similar messages around, valuing their workforce and CSR and so on. So anything you can do to sort of find a slightly new angle for that story, I think that's something that journalists will be really receptive to right now. Research outlets and journalists before pitching is really important, even before coronavirus, but also now. There's been a number of redundancies at different publications. Beats might have changed for different journalists working at publications. So as best you can, it's important to understand who you might be pitching to and being cognizant of that dynamic. And finally, be patient. This is one of the key things. I have a feeling journalists might say this every year. But I think, given the fact that their resources are so tight right now and they're under a lot of pressure, I think they're just looking for a little bit of patience when they're being pitched to, that they are covering a lot of ground, perhaps more ground than they have done in the past. So one kind of key thing they were asking for as part of this survey was for a little bit more patience. Okay, and then I'll throw open another question to Sinead. So we've seen lately in the media, there's been a little bit of criticism due to conflicting storylines, sometimes slightly even contradictory storylines as well. So for example, one day the message is to stay at home. The next day we feel like we want to join in a protest around Black Lives Matter. How has this affected the work that you do as a PR and comms professional?
Yeah, I mean, the news agenda at the moment is so noisy, and we are having really transparent conversation with clients up front about, the being realistic about getting coverage and how much coverage you're going to get, because it is just changing every day at a pace that I don't think we've ever seen before. Having said that, where we have seen success, and we've landed some really big things over the last few weeks. We've been really flexible about launch dates, and we've had plan Bs and plan Cs in our packets ready to go, and we've been able to like shift things around at short notice as bigger stories break or things change. We have also we've been like really thinking about regional angles a lot, and I think that's only going to become more important. Like we've got to be all over the local news agenda at the moment. And I think we've seen it this week with Leicester. There's going to be more Leicesters, and I think it's really interesting that Reuters research that was saying that also local newspapers are really trusted, and I think that's an opportunity that we should be thinking about. I think that I'd add to the list from this research is, journalists have been saying email since the dawn of time. I would say though, we are even now with everyone at home and everything a bit chaotic, we have still been making calls as part of our sell-ins, but we've been like super targeted about them, and we've been very, very clear about the relevancy, and it's definitely about quality rather than quantity. So yeah, I think that's the only thing that I'd say differently from that list.
Fantastic. And so maybe one final question from me before I hand over to Nadine for the Q&A. Do you think, generally speaking, we're going to see a really drastically different relationship between PR agencies and journalists going forwards?
I think we're going to have to build a lot of new relationships, which can feel frustrating. But there's been so many moves, and a lot of furloughs and probably more cuts to come. So Twitter has been a really helpful tool for us to see, who's going where. I also think something that we can bring to journalists, because I know you were saying that this research was done in like February, March. I reckon if it had been done in the last month, there would have been comments about diversifying the voices that we're hearing from and the stories that we're telling in response to the Black Lives Matter movement, but also coming out of Pride Month. And I think that's something where we can help journalists in terms of the spokespeople that we're putting forward, and the stories that we're telling, and being really mindful about the voices that we're elevating and why. So I think that's a way that we can be really helpful. And also, I think there's more onus on us to do a lot more research on who we're going to and why, and also a lot more thinking on how you're carving up a story, what are the different angles that can play out. But I don't think it's a bad thing that the news agenda at the moment demands us to be like best foot forward at all times. I actually think that's a really great opportunity for anyone working in this industry at the moment to like upskill and learn a lot about their craft, and how to be really excellent at their job, and that's no bad thing.
Absolutely.
That's great. Thank you, Sinead. Thank you, Dave. Some really valuable insights there. And it's been great hearing about the projects that Kindred Agency has been involved in as well, especially around positive change. You gave a few examples earlier on. We've had a lot of questions in already. Please keep them coming. On the left-hand side, you'll see the Q&A widget. Before we dive into the audience questions, Sinead, what would you say are the 3 points you'd advise other agencies or PR professionals to focus on now that we're coming out of the pandemic and into a new normal?
Yeah. For agencies, I would say rip up the rulebook coming out of this. I think everything from your policies, your benefits, your office setup needs looking at again with fresh eyes, because the world has changed, and that's no bad thing. When there is chaos, there is opportunity. 2, I'd say, for agency leaders or kind of any business leader, really, I think it's so important at the moment to communicate frequently and transparently. I think, the next few months are going to be challenging, and you've got to be open with people and bring people on a journey. And also be mindful that when you're managing people, there's a lot of anxiety going on at the moment about all sorts of things. And that's not magically going to disappear at the end of this year. And then thirdly, I would say focus on what you know. there is a real role, I think, for PR and strategic consultancy to play a really important role as we rebuild and recover from this. All the pieces have been thrown up in the air. And I think outside perspective that is strategically robust will be really highly valued. And I think there's an opportunity for the PR industry to demonstrate the impact and the value that we can add.
That's excellent. So rip up the rule book, be transparent in your comms, be frequent in your comms, and focus in on what you know. I like that. It's excellent advice. Thank you, Sinead. Right, let's move on to the audience. We've had quite a few questions through. I'll start with this one. Actually, Sinead, you mentioned earlier around climate change, and do you think more specifically, for example, single-use plastic, do you think that's going to be a topic of discussion in the media following coronavirus? And also what brands are doing to switch from this?
Definitely, because I think we're going to see a lot more data at the back end of this year in terms of, because we weren't all going out into town and getting coffees or buying water bottles. I think there'll be some interesting stories to be told on like the drop in single-use plastic. And then I think any brand or product that can come out and say, we use this time to innovate or bring forward our rollout of this solution, I think will be looked on really favourably coming out of this. So yeah, I definitely think there's a lot more to come in the media about green credentials and climate change.
And I think more broadly, yeah, sure, Dave.
I might just add on there as well. I think not just in terms of what brands and companies are doing, I think there's more pressure now more than ever for politicians to start making those changes as well. To think about, the kind of ways they can implement change with the amount of public pressure there is. And obviously there's a big build up around, Greta Thunberg and this kind of Green New Deal early this year. And that's obviously gone a bit quieter now with the fact that we've been in this coronavirus situation. So I think I fully expect that to kind of come roaring back as this year develops, and once kind of, like we've seen, that coronavirus hyper focus starts to kind of disappear a little bit in the rest of the year.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think more broadly as well, I think we've seen a sort of new appreciation of supporting local businesses as well. So lots of good to come from this. If we take it one step further, what trends would you say we'll see influencing most news stories in the coming months? Sinead?
I think we're going to see a lot of pivots, I think, is going to be like the word of 2020. And we'll see a lot of stories about companies or brands or charities that were doing X, but then pivoted because of coronavirus and did Y, and this has been the results from it. So I think that's going to be something that there's going to be a lot of interest for.
Yeah. Absolutely. I've got a question for Dave. Dave, you mentioned that this report was created a couple of months ago at the onset of the pandemic in the Western countries. And if you were to look at this research this month specifically, how would you anticipate the evolution? And, we realize it's going to be sort of looking ahead into the future. And I know you don't have a crystal ball, but if we were to look at that research right now, how do you think it would look?
It's a good question. So the report that we're sharing here today is something that we've made publicly available, but we've had a number of our clients come back to us asking for more specifics for their country and for more recent data as well. So we've already been doing a little bit of that work to look on a country-by-country basis how it's different. And I think, by and large, it largely depends on the situation that's going on in that particular country. So I think a number of Western countries now have their number of cases under control a little bit more, are starting to open up shopping and so on a little bit more, and able to restart these conversations around production and sales and so on. Whereas in the UK, we know that the level of infection is still a little bit too high, probably for where it needs to be. We're going to see these localized lockdowns. I think that's what's going to be really interesting to see in the next few months. The Leicester story was just broke yesterday. I think if we're going to have a summer of these little localized shutdowns that people are going to have to be really cognizant of and adaptable to if it's going to impact in any sort of communication that they're doing. So I think that's one kind of key thing to look out for.
Yeah, excellent. And I've got a question here for Sinead, actually, around sort of pitching product-based stories. Do you think there's still scope for that, particularly with a coronavirus angle, or do you think that there's a decline there in terms of interest?
It depends. I definitely think there's still scope for it. One of the things that we did out of Positive Hour actually was launching a toilet tissue brand called Serious Tissues, and that originally was there to plant trees and all profits going to projects addressing climate change, but they pivoted and all the profits were going to the NHS, and that change kind of happened a few weeks over as the pandemic was first evolving. And by the time that we were going out with that story, we were probably a little bit later than other, there'd been loads in the media at that point about things funding the NHS, but actually because there was a story behind it about, you know, the founders and why they'd made this change and how, like, it did work really well. So I think there's definitely appetite for products, and also there hasn't been as many product launches and product innovation stories as there would have been in a normal year. So actually, I think if you've got a good story to tell about it, I definitely think there'd be interest in it. And journalists actually might be a bit starved for new news, completely disconnected from COVID.
Right. Yeah. And actually, if we sort of look at the FMCG and retail sector, Dave, this is one for you. What do you think other sectors and SMEs can learn from the lessening of the restrictions in these sectors? And I mean, these are high velocity sectors and very product focused as well. So what learnings do you think they can take from this?
I think it's the same way that we approached that report we just talked through, where we looked at China for lessons that could be learned as they're 2 months ahead of the curve. I think the same thing can be done for other sectors that aren't FMCG and retail. They can kind of closely watch how this is going to work out in the next month or two as these restrictions are eased. So I would expect when we have, you know, conversations around implementing social distancing in retail environments, there's going to be a ton that people can learn from, you know, the case studies, who did a good job and who struggled, to really work through that in a meaningful way. But I also think the way that there's a lot of adaptability and flexibility within the sector as well. I talked about the contactless deliveries of food delivery services in China and now in the UK as well. It's a sign that this innovation, I think Sinead mentioned it already, you know, everything is very flexible and it's a lot more adaptable now than it ever was before. So I think other sectors can definitely look for that sort of innovation to make sure that, you know, they're being compliant with this new normal that we're living in terms of social distancing restrictions and so on, but also any innovations that might help consumers feel more connected to brands, any innovations that help people feel more connected with other people, you know, in terms of like technological solutions. So I think the next couple of months are going to be really interesting to see how this works and how it shakes out, who does a good job, who doesn't do well, and for other sectors to take those learnings to feed into their strategy going forward.
Mm-hmm. Excellent. I think we've also seen a lot of questions around whether brands should take a stand at the moment. Obviously, there's a lot going on at the moment, not just around coronavirus. And the Edelman Trust Barometer, actually in 2019, it suggested that 56% of people say that brands overuse social issues as a marketing ploy. But how important would you say it is, Sinead, for companies to make a public stand now in this current climate?
I think it's become more important in 2020, and I'd be really interested to see how that research would change in 2020, because I think brands that have taken a stand and been at the forefront of things like Ben and Jerry's have been exemplary over the past few weeks. I think that it's been really well received. And, you know, Dave was saying earlier that there's been you've seen kind of a bit of hunger from consumers to engage with the brands that they really like and matter to them in a way they haven't been able to in a normal year. And for me, that runs through into like politics and ethics and taking a stance. As long as it's properly done and it's genuine and it's not just, there's action to back up the words, I think that's going to be a really big shift that we see this year and next year.
And I think this sort of trust topic is obviously quite a big one. I think that's something we've seen over the last few years, erosion of trust, whether that's in media, in politicians, or in brands as a whole. We've got a question here specifically about insurers, sort of saying, what advice would you give to insurers to regain trust in the industry? Is that something, Sinead, that you can comment on?
I mean, I think, the insurers it's interesting because they've had I mean, like everyone, they've had a challenging year, and I think they've been on the receiving end of criticism. I think there's an opportunity in the latter part of this year for insurance brands that are able to talk openly and honestly about maybe what they've learned, own up if mistakes have been made, and talk about what they'll do differently coming out of it. I think a bit of honesty and humility could really help build customer faith in that sector.
Excellent. We talked a little bit earlier as well. Yeah, go ahead.
I was just going to say, and not being afraid to share the good news stories as well, because they will be there, but they probably haven't as much airtime as the negative things.
Yeah, absolutely. You mentioned earlier about SMEs and sort of saying that 2021 will really be the year for rebuilding SMEs. Are there any practical tips that you can share perhaps with the audience on that approach of rebuilding?
I mean, it varies so, like the SME sector is so varied. I think like practical things will be, I think we should just take a moment to breathe and reflect on what we've learned this year. Because, when we're in the thick of it, it can be really difficult to see the wood from the trees. But actually things will have accelerated, and we will have learned a lot about ourselves and our businesses. And I think as the things begin to calm down, we should take a moment, as business leaders, but also with the broader company to talk about what we've learned, what we've done well, and what we'll do differently. So you actually take some really kind of concrete and actionable things out of the storm that was 2020 to make things improve and run more smoothly in 2021.
Yeah. Absolutely. We've had a question from the charity sector as well. So obviously this is very busy sector, and there's a question around being approached to provide comment on cancer news and really how to get in front of very busy health correspondents. Any advice there?
I would say, I mean, I think it was one of the points on one of those slides, but the journalists that we're hearing journalists saying to us at the moment, like, be patient. I do want to do this. I am going to get to it. I'm just inundated. So I think there is an element of being more patient than when we normally would be. But also I would say if you're struggling, be a bit more targeted about who and why that person, and go into detailed thinking about how it would play out and what you can provide and why it's useful, and then kind of try again with a super succinct first approach.
Yeah, brilliant. Excellent. Another question on the sort of pharma biotech industry. We're working our way through the different sectors here, obviously a broad audience today. This is around sort of obviously the high expectations of a vaccine that may or may not be ready in the near future. And there's been coverage of a vaccine that was going to be ready early, and the sort of release has gone horribly wrong. How would you suggest companies communicate around these topics?
I mean, this is where there's a real role for expert spokespeople. And I think in a way that we didn't, in the year when the Brexit vote happened, there was a big pushback against experts. But something that's really kind of come to the fore this year is actually people wanting to hear from experts. And I think there's been an amazing array of scientists that have spoken very eloquently and clearly about what they're doing and why. And I think it's about taking the public on a journey. I think people do understand that we are in absolutely unprecedented times. And I think it's about frequent, clear comms that make people understand what's happening and why.
Yeah, absolutely.
Maybe just to add on that point as well, I think, part of the slides that we talked through showed the fact that people are turning to trusted media more than ever right now because of the situation they're in. They want to make sure they're getting information that's correct and accurate and so on. So I think within that sector, it's important to make sure that you're targeting your efforts towards those really trusted outlets that people are going to, really understand. And like Sinead said, having the opinions and the clear kind of expert advice from those people within those industries as well is going to be really important.
Yeah. We've had a joke around the office, actually, that it's sort of crazy how we're heading towards the second half of 2020 already. And we've just had a question through around thoughts on Christmas gifting press. Anything there, Sinead?
So I was reading something from a journalist earlier who was saying how much they are still getting products sent to their home that they can have in their hands, and it's still like there's still so much joy that comes from that, but also it's like there's nothing beats seeing a product, touching a product, and they were sharing tips on how to wrap things and how to present things, and little things like just don't make the box impossible to get into, because if you've got like 10 to unwrap, you might give up on the one that you can't get into. So I definitely think that there's opportunity there, but again, it's going to be interesting actually how Christmas goes, because I think there's two ways it could go. You could have I think we're seeing one of the trends coming out of China, like people spending on high-end quality luxury items to reward themselves for the times they spent in lockdown, and that's one way it could go. But also I think it's more likely to go to things that are either greener or not massively expensive, because the reality is a lot of families in this country this Christmas are going to feel a bit cash strapped, and actually there's an opportunity to encourage people to not have massively excessive Christmases, and spend wisely. And again, it loops back to small businesses and local businesses, and where you put your pounds and pence really matters, and I think people are a lot more aware of that, and I think we'll see that play out in the Christmas gifting trends too.
Yeah, I think that's definitely a trend that we've seen. And I think also a big opportunity perhaps for PR when you think about, technology obviously has been fantastic in the last few months. We're all working from home, we're utilizing technology in a fantastic way. But at the same time, I think for PRs, there's that moment now of providing empathy and be sensitive around complex issues, perhaps in a way that technology can't. Would you say there's a big opening there for PR in terms of opportunities?
Definitely. I mean, 2020 is the year to be really human about everything that you're doing, whether that's how you're dealing with your employees, it's how you're working with clients and stakeholders. And it almost feels weird to say that, because it also has been the year of just like, thank God for technology that we can all still talk to each other. But I think, the opportunity is to be really human and empathetic about how we do it.
Excellent. Thanks so much, Sinead. Thank you, Dave. I think that's all we have time for today. Thank you to everyone who was able to join us today. We've had some great engagement. Thank you for tweeting us, for sending in your questions. Plus, of course, huge thank you to Dave and Sinead for your expertise. We've added a number of useful resources in the panel on your screen, so you should be able to see our annual State of the Media report. Do check them out. They contain helpful pieces of information, both for your PR and comms going forward. I'd also like to give you a date for the diaries. It's the 30th of July, which will be our next webinar. We'll be using that to discuss key topics from the 2020 Global AMEC Summit, so make sure you don't miss out on that one. And a quick reminder that a recording of the session will also be available soon. And if you'd like a personal consultation on how to emerge out of the pandemic, please get in touch. Thanks again for joining us. Have a lovely afternoon. Goodbye.